Here we go. It's the 14th chapter of John today, for the lesson for the 6th Sunday of Easter. And it begins, Jesus said to Judas, not Judas Iscariot, those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and they will come to them and make our home with them. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words, and the word that you hear is not mine, but it is from the Father who sent me. I have said these things to you while I am still with you. But the advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. You heard me say, I am going away, and I am coming to you. If you loved me, you would rejoice that I'm going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. And now I have told you this before it occurs, so that when it does occur, you may believe. Here ends the lesson. So we need the context for this particular lesson. And the context is, well, we know from the 14th chapter of John that this is Jesus, what we have called, I know we've talked about this before, the Last Supper discourse. It's a very long segment of John's gospel. Nothing seems to be quick or easy in John. And it is Jesus, or it's alternatively known as Jesus' farewell sermon, or his last testament. Sometimes it's labeled that in study Bibles and so on, because it is sort of Jesus' final words to his disciples before the rapid fire events that take place immediately following the Last Supper. Because it's at this point then that once the supper is concluded, the action or the end is set in motion. You will have heard already, that's why he makes the point, Judas, not Iscariot. This is the disciple, I believe, who is sometimes known as Bartholomew, that Jesus has gone to Judas and spoken with Judas, saying, he who dips his sop, who takes the sop with me is the one who will betray me. And that whole thing transpires. Jesus turns to Judas and says, what thou must do quickly. And Judas leaves. And there's that wonderful phrase that we hear on the gospel on the Wednesday of Holy Week. And Judas went out and it was night. It's one of the shortest verses in John. It was night. The whole idea that he's going out into the darkness. And then the supper continues, and this is part of that continuation of the supper and the discussion that Jesus is having, more of a dissertation than a discussion. But and Jesus speaks of many things. And at this point, he is discussing or speaking about his departure from this world, which in the narrative of John's gospel is imminent. Because, as we mentioned, at the conclusion of the supper, rapid fire events begin to occur that over the course of the next day will end up with Jesus on the cross. And of course, within 3 hours, Jesus physically dead, and then dismounted from the cross, taken and buried in the new hewn tomb that we hear discussed. And that's the end. And the disciples now scatter for the four winds in a way. They no longer are this band of close associates. And Jesus kind of knows them. And Jesus like any good leader, they know that once you decapitate, and that this is often the strategic plan for war is decapitate the leadership. I mean, for example, the most recent occurrence of that with Ukraine, the whole idea of going after Kyiv and basically to decapitate the government. In other words, take the leadership away and everyone will fall in line because you don't have the brains, as it were. And so just like the human body, if you cut off the head, then the rest of the body dies quickly. And that organic metaphor is often seen in terms of organizations or tribes or nations. So that's the whole idea of the leadership of the Jewish people at the time, is to go after the head, go after Jesus, and then the rest of them will go back home. And that's the way the plan is carried out. But it doesn't work out that way. What happens is it just multiplies and begins to take on a form that was not expected by anyone. I know I've mentioned this example too before, and it is in Jesus. There's a scene well interpreted in Jesus of Nazareth by Zeffirelli. He was the director. A lot of people, the credits roll and all that sort of stuff. And then just around that time, people kind of lose interest. But there's this wonderful little scene, it's very short, where Zerah, who is the scribe, who is sort of the leitmotif through the entire story, he's always around. He's the one who is in the chambers of the high priest, Caiaphas and Annas, when the guards come and say, well, they've taken the body away, and they're all the leadership of the Jewish people at the time say, oh, that's over now. Finally, that's over. And Zerah turns right to the camera and he says, it's only beginning. This sort of prophetic statement that you think you've won. In fact, you've probably made it worse. If you were trying to get rid of this movement, what happened to George? If you get rid of the head, the movement will fall apart. Well, Jesus, we get the shadow of how that's, or a foreshadowing, I should say, of how that is going to be not the case in this particular passage when Jesus talks about the advocate. The advocate is a specific name given to the personage of God we call the Holy Spirit within the Trinity and our understanding of the Trinity. And an advocate is a very specific term that is used, and John uses it in its fullest sense. In the Greek, the word means a great deal. We think of an advocate as someone who takes up the cause of another, and that's the root meaning of it. But it is also a very technical legal term. And in fact, in some languages, for example, in Polish, when I was growing up and we had a small Polish kind of ghetto community on the east side of Buffalo, you'd go by an office and you'd have signs both in English and in Polish. And at an attorney's office, it would be attorney at law, but the Polish side would say advokat. This notion that the advocate speaks not only as someone who is pushing someone's cause, but as a defender of the individual. It's a broader mission. And not only go ahead.
It's like a child advocate.
Yes, or victims advocates that we have and so on. That it's a very large role that the advocate plays. this is going to be kind of an odd metaphor to make, but it's kind of like the consigliere in a mob family. It's the lawyer who is the one who both does the legal work for the businesses of the crime family, but also is there at the ready and at the call at any moment to do what needs to be done to defend the family and its membership. So we might, if we put this passage into modern terminology, we might hear Jesus say, I'm going to send you a consigliere. So it's like, you're going to have that person who has everybody's interest within the family. And that's the key piece here. Within the organization, within the family, that has the interest of everyone at heart, especially the mission. What is the purpose? Because even in, again, not to use sort of a negative metaphor, which it definitely would be, but the crime family, the sort of mob family, if you will, has a larger mission. And that mission is the maintenance of the organization of the family. Even the Don and the capos, the head guy and the minor officers within the family, they are important, and each of them needs an aspect of the, here he's back. Each of them is important, and each of them needs the work of the advocate, that it is for a higher cause, a higher purpose. And that is to be sure that the family continues, that the institution moves its mission forward. Because you can cut off the head of a crime family, and there is someone else there ready and at the able to, or able and at the ready, you get my phrases mixed up here, to take over. Okay, but the family perdures. That's the mission. George, just to kind of bring you up to speed here, we're sorry we lost you for a moment.
Yeah.
I'm making the shift. We're trying to describe what this notion of advocate is in this passage. And the long and short of what I just did was to say that it's more like a consigliere in a mob family. Because the consigliere in a mob family is not simply a lawyer that is engaged to do certain work, but has the whole family always, and its integration and integral movement and mission in mind. And in fact, when you cut off the head of the family, you send them to prison, or he's killed in a mob war, there's always someone else ready to take over leadership. But the family perdures. And that's the key element here, is that when Jesus tells the disciples, I am sending you an advocate, it is not simply for you.
Let me call you back in a little while. I'm on a conference call. Yeah. Okay, about 2:00. Yeah.
I don't want to lose him again. Yes. Oh, there he is. Okay, he did freeze. Okay, so we don't, this notion of advocate is much bigger than simply being a spokesperson, which is kind of what we in current modern language think of as advocate, but rather has this larger mission of seeking out the ultimate interests of the group, of the tribe, the institution, the family, however we want to name it, so that the Holy Spirit becomes the advocate. George, just before you got back on, I said we might hear Jesus say these words if we want to use this metaphor. I will send you a conciliary rather than I will
Yeah,
send you
right.
an advocate. You know,
Yeah.
and that sounds weird, but it is more accurate as to what Jesus is doing here. So that while the powers that be, when they got rid of Jesus, felt that they may have won the day in their striving against stamping out this sect in Judaism, that in fact, because there was actually involved in this process a conciliary, an advocate, someone else would actually step into leadership and they will not have won. So that this notion that the resurrection or the crucifixion was not the end, but rather just the beginning, is all dependent on this idea of the advocate being sent by Jesus once he is at one with the Father. That advocate is always with and in the church, and that advocate's task, job, mission, job description, whatever you want to call it, is to do that work of protecting the wider interests of the group. So and the group in this case is the capital C church, not the denomination, but the church, the body of Christ as it is present in the world. And so for us to have this notion of a sort of very weak idea of the Spirit actually weakens the fabric of the church, because it is the work of the Spirit that does this. And whenever we discount the work of the Spirit or we fail to account for it, we are missing where our strength lies.
I think
Go ahead.
let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
Now, with the death of Jesus and the confusion after that, there was great fear that the people would come after them and kill them, and they dispersed. And then Peter has this dream and is being told to actually bring the people back together again. And they do that. And this is where he becomes the sort of de facto leader at that time. They don't know where they're headed or what they're going to do.
Right.
But he is being driven by forces he doesn't understand.
Absolutely.
And then there are what they say thousands of people who are looking for what's going to happen to them now that Jesus is dead.
Right.
And then we lead up into the description of Pentecost.
Absolutely. And who is the one who steps out in that Pentecost story in Acts but Peter?
Yeah.
And he's the one who starts the sermon on Pentecost Day itself. Men of Jerusalem, and he goes out and they're there for the festival. And that's when we hear about how all of the people that were there, because it was the festival day in Jerusalem, they were from all corners of Judaism, all corners of the known world, and they spoke all these different languages. And one of the testaments to the mission of this advocate, the Spirit, is the reconciliation of the world to God. And all we need to do to understand the power of Luke's story, now this is Luke, of Pentecost, is to travel back into the Old Testament, into the 11th chapter of Genesis. And there we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And prior to that event, in the mythology of the first chapters of Genesis, it even is said, everyone spoke the same language and everyone understood each other. The problem was that in human hubris, they forgot who God was relative to creation and decided to feel themselves that they could approach God by building this tower. Now, I know the fundamentalists will say it's a real tower and we got to go find the place where it was and all that kind of stuff. And that's nonsense because it's a mythological story. But the idea, it's the same idea. So God comes down, it says, and confuses them. And the instrument of confusion is to make them speak different languages. So now they could not come together with such power as to build this edifice up into the heavens to touch God. Pentecost undoes that. So the idea is now with the power of this, and it's only with the power of the Holy Spirit. So it's only at God's discretion that we move away from the confusion of languages to the unity of mission. But that mission is no longer governed by human hubris, but by the very intention, the will of God from the beginning. So what the story of the Old in Luke's mind, the story of the Old Testament, which began with the unity of creation and harmony and the whole Eden idea, ended tragically with the Tower of Babel, because from then on, it's the story of Abraham and the people of Israel and so on. That's all in the process of God's mind, where we come now to this point, and it is now that God begins the process of making it right again. Not to borrow a phrase, or use a phrase, but that's why, for example, when we hear in the letter to the Hebrews or even Paul and even some of our prayer book, in these last days, what we are living then is in the beginning of the end, the Eschaton, where it was the Pentecost event in our understanding of God that began the grand reconciliation, the execution of that plan, rather, of the grand reconciliation of restoring creation to what God wanted it to be in the first place. Now we have a long way to go. Since we're kind of destroying the creation we know, our little, as I love that, Eucharistic prayer, see this little earth, our island home, it really says you're just a speck in the grand universe. Who says that the rest of the universe is not as God has intended? That's us little humans on this little blue marble in the middle of nowhere. That is, we just messed it all up. And so God is helping us put our little piece of the universe back together. Now, whether that will actually happen in any of our lifetime, we don't know, probably not. And it will take generation after generation after generation. But what the idea is here is that it is God's work, not ours. And so it's this grand cosmic conciliary who is at work here. And that the work of the advocate is this work. So that's why Jesus says, do not fear. Because and the promise is for us that if you engage in this work of the kingdom, then you need not fear, because even if they take your immortal life, I have shown you the way to eternal life. So I have taken away any fear that you should have relative to doing the will of God in making the world as it should be, which is a world of justice, which is a world of shalom. There's that word again. We talked about this a few weeks ago. When Jesus comes, he says these words whenever he appears to them. Now, this is before the crucifixion. So this is Jesus already foreshadowing this. He says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give you peace as the world gives. See, because that's a broken peace. Because the world is broken. I give you peace, which is the peace of the great advocate of the cosmic consigliere, if you want to use that term, that image, who will constantly guard this entity we call the church, the body of Christ, the family of Christians, brothers and sisters, doing the work of the kingdom. And that's what Jesus is talking about at the Last Supper. Of course, continuing, the disciples still are kind of clueless. But even Jesus understands that. And he says, I tell you this now, so that when it happens, you will not be afraid. And you're right. When it was actually in the process, they were very afraid. But they got over it.
Well, it took them a while to figure out what was happening.
Yeah.
And when they got together, and the people were coming to them from everywhere to, now that he's dead, where are we? What is going to happen to us? We got into the cataclysmic event of everybody being changed before their eyes. And then it finally dawned on them that there was a spirit that entered them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they saw it, they figured it out. And so it's being handed to us on a platter. And yet it seems odd to me that something as fundamental of that as that tends not to get the emphasis that it deserves.
Right. And hence my concern about us not really understanding the Pentecost event or celebrating it in such a way that it reminds us of its deep meaning.
Yeah.
We sort of, in terms of catechetical tools, we have often, put names on it, like the birthday of the church. And so, I can see doing this with little kids, but, I know parishes where they have a birthday party for the church on Pentecost. I mean, that makes it, that diminishes it and sort of decentralizes this as the core event really of the church's life. And our Pentecostal brothers and sisters get it, but then they really kind of overemphasize the unpredictability, the emotionality, all that kind of stuff of this part. And it really needs to be this balance. I go back to my friend, now gone to God, Archbishop Breyer. You need both hands. You need Christ, the victor. We sing that on Sundays during the Easter season after the gospel. Christus vincit, Christus regna, Christus imperat. Jesus conquers, Jesus reigns, Jesus, and then it's hard to translate. Jesus emperors is what it says basically, but what that means is he's over all kings. He's the King of Kings. So that's that left hand, and then the right hand, the palsied hand that Raya talked about, needs to be strengthened and in the church. And that's when the spirit is alive, and you need these two things constantly interacting. Hence, we have the Sunday after Pentecost, which is Trinity Sunday, where you have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all in view. But we get so hung up on explaining the doctrinal, how can this be? Three persons, one God, all this kind of stuff. That forgetting about that's what this is really about, is about this notion that all three persons are acting all the time, that it isn't one or the other. And you can see even in denominational emphases, various, focuses on one or another of the persons of the Trinity, because we we feel that somehow over time and institutionally, we can't handle this. We can. The first disciples did, and so can we. It's hard. It's hard. But no one said it would be easy. That's why Jesus sends us the advocate. It's not our work or our strength. Hence our conversation actually at vestry just the other day. And then Kathy, you and I were talking a bit about this yesterday. Diversity. The Episcopal Church's emphasis on the diversity of the human race relative to racial identity, and language, all that sort of thing. The Anglican way is theoretically to emphasize diversity, because then we find the diversity of gifts, and it's not dependent on what the color of your skin or your nation of origin or the language you speak or any of those kinds of things. And we even extend it to even your sexual orientation or your gender presentation. That doesn't matter, because yes, we're enfleshed and we're incarnate beings, but the ultimate goal is to bring all of it together, and it is the Spirit that does it, and we can't control how the Spirit does it. So if the Spirit wants to use trans people to do it, fine. If the Spirit wants to use gay people to do it, fine. If the Spirit wants to use Black people to do it, fine. If the Spirit wants to use Asian people, fine. That's supposed to be our affirmation. And too often what we get to is, well, we want to stay with our own because that's where we're comfortable. But the Spirit is not comfortable.
Like us.
Say again?
We want to make everybody just like us.
Yes, yes. Even, and that's when I came to St. Luke's, it's one of the things we tried to get away from, was because it worked for a time, for a season, but I think we overused it. And that was the Episcopal Church welcomes you. That's a very passive thing. We open our arms and open our doors. And if you want to come in, fine. But then what would you do when they come in? Oh, here's the prayer book. You have to do it this way. You have to stand. You have to kneel. You have to sing this. You have to do, and if you don't do it that way, well, maybe you don't belong here.
And maybe
rather than saying,
won't even talk to you.
Yeah, well, and rather than say, what can you bring to us? What do you bring? Why is God sending you here? See, that's a different question or a different statement than, oh, you're all are welcome, but all are invited, and we want to know why God sends you to us. And that's why, that's a revelatory question, really, when you think about it. I got a very sad response, and I'm very concerned about this. And we need to address this in the parish eventually. But when we did the survey for music and worship, in one of the comment sections, it wasn't necessarily focused on music, but it's relative to our worship life. There's a person who said, my parents, and I have worshiped in this space. He said for 70 years. And yet I feel like a stranger. And the individual then went on to say, when we used to walk around the church and give the sign of peace, very few people would come up to me. And even at coffee hour, I would sit and no one would speak to me. Now, possibly, that's not all on everybody else. We all have different personalities and so on. And sometimes, we can be introverts, extroverts, and so on. And if someone's quite introverted, they're not going to move out to other people easily. That's out of their comfort zone. But the reality, and sometimes people, good Episcopalians, oh, God forbid we should cross anybody's, space, that when someone themselves aren't ebullient and outward going, we kind of want to give them their space. Well, there's a balancing act to that too, and we have to move out to people who are alone or seem to be alone, and have our antenna up always, assessing, do they want, to be accompanied, or are they simply there and they want to be left alone. Sometimes we need to be left alone, in our grief or whatever. But the very fact that this person would say this on this survey and that they are a long-standing parishioner for St. Luke's to think of itself as, oh, we're a warm, welcoming community. This is somebody, one of our own, who is feeling this way. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but it is time. It is the occasion to have the discussion. And that which presents to us, do we need to really focus on a genuine ministry of hospitality within the parish? And that means more than just managing coffee hour or giving a bulletin to somebody as they walk in the door and showing them a seat, but actually being trained, having a small group of people whose gifts enable them to be trained to assess those situations and to sort of scan the room and to see the loner. And does the loner really want somebody to come up to them, or they just want to be alone? There are ways of telling. But see, I can't imagine that we ever had a training at St. Luke's as to how to be a minister of hospitality in that regard. Probably good training, how to be a good usher, how to greet people, show them where things are. I remember when I first came to St. Luke, and Ken, I'm going to use him as an example. He's in the other room. He can hear me. Came and he said to me, I have a question for you. And he said, because of some of my health issues, I always want to know where the restrooms are. And he asked an usher, and nobody knew who he was, asked an usher where the restroom was, and the usher pointed to the sign at the back of the church, which has an arrow going that way. Now, before we even put in the accessible restroom near the choir, there were no signs to tell anybody there was a restroom there. And we all know how hard it is to get to the restrooms in the parish hall. Actually, it's maybe not so hard to get there. It's getting back into the church where the problem is. You come out, you go like, how did I get in here? And I've actually had people say that they had to go outside. They saw the door, the parish hall door. So they went outside and went out through the outside back into the church. Well, in the wintertime, that's not so easy. So we start to think about these things. It's like, I remember when I worked for May Company as a retail clerk, one of our trainings was hospitality. And the idea was, first of all, you had to, try to find out the person's name, either by their, their credit card or whatever, and always use their name. But one of the things is if they ever ask you where something is, you don't point or you don't say it's upstairs, you take them there. And that's a lesson I learned in retail, not in church. But that's a lesson we need to learn. That's a very small thing. But those are the things where there's a gift. If someone tends to be affable and outgoing, they can be trained, they can be taught to find the signs as to whether someone is simply a loner and needs to be brought in, needs to be, addressed, or if they simply want to be alone. I mean, there are times when, quite frankly, I'm the priest of the parish, so I have to kind of live with it, that people want to come up to me all the time at any time and talk about anything. But there are times when I just want to go into my safe space. Well, I make sure I have the discipline to do that at other times, because I just know it's not possible before or after liturgy. And there are times when, that's one reason I do kind of float around the parish prior to liturgy, but then I disappear into the vesting sacristy. And there are times in the vesting sacristy, I've told people to be quiet because they want to have a chat, they're talking about football, whatever. I said, I need some space, please, is usually what I say. And they know what that means. It means Father needs some quiet time. Because think of what the priest celebrant, especially if you're also the homilist, has to do in the next hour and a half. Say at the 10:30, 8 o'clock's not a problem. At the 10:30, when you have all these people floating around, where you need to kind of collect yourself as to what you're about to do spiritually. But also, if you're preaching, and how I preach, collect your thoughts, get everything organized in your brain, make sure you've got all of everything. Everybody thinks I just talk off the top of my head. I don't. There's a process, and sometimes I need a little bit of quiet in order to make sure I, finalize that before I walk out. Sometimes that's also the case of people in church. They want time to be still, to be quiet, to meditate, to pray. But there are ways of recognizing that. And that's what I'm hoping in the future, we can find people with gifts for hospitality, but then who we can sit down and have a session and say, okay, here are some resources. Here are some ways of looking at this. These are ways of reaching out to people, especially new people. New people don't want to be inundated. This has been the problem. This is not so much at St. Luke's, because St. Luke's is in such a small parish. But when I've been in really small parishes, you get a visitor and everybody, it's like the vultures are there. They're all like descending on this person because, oh my gosh, there's somebody new. What can they do for us? Not why is God sending you here, but what can you do for us? It's like, so, or they're just so exuberant that someone new is in the room that they really want to like welcome them and everything. And they just feel like, oh my God, they leave and never come back again. So, I mean, that's actually happened. So it's a balance that we have to find. So when Jesus, go back to scriptures, when Jesus is talking about the advocate, it's the advocate who has all of those interests at heart within the community. But we have to allow those gifts to emerge. We have to provide the environment for them to flourish. And then we have to call people into the practice of them. That's the only way we'll exercise that weak arm, is to actually exercise the spiritual gifts, because that's where they come from.
We've been struggling with these problems for 49 years that I've been here at St. Luke's. And I have watched several different priests grapple with what we're talking about, because it has been one of our fears. And sometimes we're too hard on ourselves, that we think we're failing when perhaps we're not failing as bad as we think. Because when we moved here 49 years ago, we had looked at another church that was in another community, an Episcopal church, and it was a very negative experience. But we were in St. Luke's. We had moved in the middle of the week, and on Sunday I said, we got to go find the church, and looked up the address in the telephone directory. Oh, it's on Chestnut Street. That's not too far from where we live. I think we can find it. And we got in there, and my interest in architecture just took over me. I was just swallowed up in it. I didn't realize the priest was interim, but he was Ed Conklin. He was a really nice guy. He gave a good sermon. And but when the service was over, Florence Asbury was immediately there on our side. And introduced herself, and we were wound up in the coffee hour and everything. And it was a totally positive experience. And I said to Betty, I said, this church is about absolute opposite of what we're used to. but the people here are wonderful. And so that's good enough for me. And I guess I'll have to figure out a way to adjust. And so and there have been times when we really tried very hard to be welcoming and warm and loving. And during one of those times that we were without a priest, the bishop asked me, he gave me a name of a priest in a suburb close to Philadelphia. And Betty and I went unannounced to that church. I was a little bit interested in that there were 4 priests, 3 of them very elderly, and the person that we were interested in was the youngest of the group. And when it came to passing the peace, Biddy and I got up and I walked over to a lady and held up my hand, and reluctantly, as though I had something awful in my hand, uh, handed me my hand and didn't make without making eye contact. And so I didn't bother to go to anybody else. And the guy's sermon wasn't very good. When we left there, I said, something's wrong with that place.
God's frozen chosen, we're known as sometimes, or chosen frozen.
So
I
I
tell
said, we're
Luke
not so
that
bad
too.
after all.
Well, and I think that's part of it is one of the things I see at St. Luke's and why I just am so happy to be there. This is not, false praise or anything, is there are tremendous gifts in this parish. I think, but for whatever reason, circumstances, historical circumstances, over the last 2.5 years, COVID, we have been stymied from exercising them. But what we really need to do as we begin to emerge from the pandemic's limitations is to take a moment and to say, so again, I want to go back to the theme we set 2 years ago, begin again. Take the time to step back and say, let's not just try to do what we did before. Let's keep doing what we're doing. But what is God calling us to do now that we have had this experience? For example, I had a pastoral care conversation about one of our parishioners who has not coped well with the COVID isolation. And it brought into a deeper conversation about the mental health implications that the pandemic has brought on people generally. But in particular, we begin with the people of our own community, our own parish. And then we extended it, even a further conversation about our young people. And part of that was, the occasion for that conversation was a news piece on, I think it was on ABC News about a week ago, where I sat watching the evening news and began to tear up as a 13-year-old boy who was 11 when the pandemic started, described his deep, deep depression as things went on, his separation from his friends, from his school activities, and so on, where he actually had thoughts of self-harm and suicide. At that tender age, I can't imagine myself, when I look back at who I was at that age. I mean, teenagers, there's a high rate of suicide among teenagers and so on. And that's part of but also one of the interesting things was his entire social life was on screen.
Yeah.
And that was both a gift and a curse, because you get the best and the worst. And what happened was the mitigating impact of being with real people that you get to know and trust on a regular basis was not there. Everything was this artificial community, which points out, we started talking about coffee hour earlier, the importance of us to begin to gather in person. We had the first in-person vestry meeting on Monday night since February of 2020.
Oh.
And the tone, the experience of it, I've encouraged, Kathy, like at holiday time, I would make all these treats and everything and ask people to share them afterwards. And everybody would maybe take a cookie or a glass of, grog or something, quickly imbibe it, eat it, and then leave. We were done at 8:30. People were still socializing almost till 9 o'clock. We had cheese and crackers and, little things. People were actually chatting, and not about parish business, but about, and it said to me, yes, the time is now. We need to start doing these things again.
During
And
this, okay, go
go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead. You finish.
Well, it 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 seemed to me that we had no idea of how many dysfunctional families there are out there. And the only thing that kept their kids from becoming dysfunctional was the fact that they could socialize every day with their friends and be elsewhere and not be locked up. And then when they were forced to live 24 hours a day with the chaos that might be there with violence and drunkenness and whatever that we never knew about, uh, drives these kids beyond their capacity to live that way.
Right, right. And that's the worst case scenario. This particular young man that I was talking about on the news, from all descriptions, was not in a horribly dysfunctional setting. In fact, his parents were so concerned that they didn't know what to do to help him.
Yeah.
It took him to a hospital, interestingly. And here was the rub. Took him to his pediatrician, or talked to his pediatrician. The pediatrician said, take him to the hospital and have him admitted for screening. They screened him. They said, yes, he needs assistance. Our first opening is, and I forgot what the date was, but it was something like 6 months later. And when it came to actually inpatient care for a short period of time, where they may need to have him in a residential facility for a short period of time, it was even longer. And so what do we do? We have not only have our ICU beds been overwhelmed in time with all of this, think of all of the other ancillary health issues and the issue of mental health that we have not even addressed in all of this. And so the question becomes, what is the role of the church in all of this? But that's when we have to ask the question, what do we have? Because we can throw up our arms and what am I going to do? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not, well, but there are other things that we can begin to do to begin to ameliorate that. And even if people need professional assistance in that realm, that we can help to bridge the gap along the way. That's why, again, we'll go back to this. Jesus sends us the advocate, the consigliere, the one who has the interest of the entire community at heart. And we need not to feel that I have to do this, or even that we have to do this corporately. But that's when we open our hearts in prayer and say, okay, God, what do you want done? And how can we help? Therein, and sometimes it's simply in the framing of the question that the answer emerges, because it's too easy to frame it in such a way which is self-determining. We can't do anything. We don't have those kinds of resources. Kathy, you were on vestry when I first came, and I think I was still the interim at the time, and I was intentionally dramatic. Ken calls me a drama queen all the time, but this is intentional. Slam my hands down on the table. I said, I never want to hear that we don't have enough money. Remember those conversations?
Only too well, because it was generally about property.
Yeah, I said,
As
this
George
parish,
understands.
at the time, I said, this parish has $1.8 million in reserve in the bank. Now, granted, it's all tied up legally and everything, but with enough determination, we can unlock that money whenever we need it, if we really genuinely need it, and we have no other resources. So we're not broke. I said, I know parishes in this diocese that do not know if they can turn the lights on Sunday or open the door with a key because they don't have anything. So, and that's what helped us turn the corner when it came to stewardship. I mean, case in point, When we began the ministry with children, youth, and young adult, we had no extra money in the budget for it. And so I asked for a diminishing 3-year grant from the diocese. I said, it'll give us time to make this sustainable. In the last 2 budgets, the expenses related to Mother Mary's position have been totally paid for by the operations budget. There's been no extra money brought in for that. And we have not cut back on any programming. We have expanded programming. We haven't cut back on maintenance. We're doing everything we're supposed to be doing. But all of that is in the framing of the challenge. Rather than operating from a position of scarcity, we operate from the position of we are operating with the abundance of God at our disposal. And if we are doing God's will and God's work, we will have what we need. It may not be what we want or what we think we need, but it will be enough, always enough, to do the work of the kingdom. That is the role of the advocate. That is the role of the consigliere, if you will. To work for the best interest of the community, not as the world gives, Jesus says, but as I give shalom, as I give wholeness, as I give peace, you will find everything you need. So don't be afraid. In our book read, and then we'll kind of come to a close, it's almost 11:30. In our book read, when we did the soul stages, during Epiphany Tide, one of the participants asked me, she paid me a high compliment in some ways, and I was happy to hear it. She said, "Father, how you do it?" I went, "Do what?" "You're always so upbeat, and you're getting us through this dark time." And because we were talking of, it was sort of an ancillary discussion to this notion of the final part of life and so on. And I said, because it's not my work, it's God's work. And that's not just lip service. I really believe that if it depended on me alone, we wouldn't be anywhere. But all I'm trying to do is point, like John the Baptist in that sense, point people to where the source of strength and the source of abundance is. That's my job. And whether that is spiritual abundance in terms of an upbeat spirit and joy and consolation and all those kinds of things. And I confess, I said, it's not always easy. Sometimes it hurts a lot. Sometimes it demands sacrifice. But that's what Jesus taught us. That's the way of Jesus' life. That's the way of love. It sometimes demands things of us. And we have to be willing to answer the call, the obligation, the demand, in order to reap the reward, not in a transactional way, because Jesus promises us that the reward will come anyway. That's what grace means. It's unmerited favor from our catechism definition. So if the promise is graced and graceful, so must our response be. And again, that's what why this passage, short as it is so powerful, because Jesus is talking about this before it happens. Even before the disciples have an idea that it might happen. They have no idea what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. And yet this is what Jesus is telling them. I will be with you. I will send you the advocate, the consigliere, if you will, to be with you, who will provide everything for you. So don't be afraid when these things actually happen. Doesn't mean that we don't experience fear. It doesn't mean that we don't experience self-doubt. It doesn't mean that we don't have any of those negative experiences or emotions. What it does say is that you need to work through that, because in the end, you will have everything you need. If we do that as a parish community, St. Luke's will not look the way it does now in 50 years. St. Luke's doesn't look now what it did 50 years ago, but we're still there. And we're still doing kingdom work. As long as we remain rooted in the Spirit, we will endure. Nobody's cutting off our head. 50 years ago, you had a different rector. You've had several since. Interims and so on. I'm going to leave. Not tomorrow, not next year, possibly the year after. I'll be blunt about it. Someone else will come with another set of gifts. And that if the power of the Spirit is alive at St. Luke's the day that I, turn my keys over to the senior warden, I will die happy. Not that I'm going to die that day. I hope. I do want some happy golden years along the way. But I can look back at my life and say, this was my legacy. And the next person then picks up where that chapter closed, a new chapter begins, and that life continues, as long as the people are filled with the Holy Spirit. It doesn't matter who's in charge, really. I mean, you went through some dark days that way. George, you remember, a couple times where, you had a very short-term rector and then a series of interims trying to put everything back together. And then you got somebody whose gifts were to heal and to bring stability and calm to a chaotic situation. And I look at it that person got that ready for me to come in and disrupt everything again. But I hope in a positive way. And then the next person will come and, there will be more transition going on as the church continues to change and the world around us continues to change. So with that in mind, we'll call it to a close.
Can I say two things real quickly?
Absolutely.
First, not about today, but today's discussion was excellent, as always. Sometime I would be willing to lead Bible study.
Great.
I need a little forewarning because I don't have your vast knowledge base yet.
Well, I've been doing it for 40-some years. So
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm so it would be
well, and also, Kathy, I can kind of coach you a little bit. If you're willing to do that, I can coach you on how to prepare.
Yeah.
And like George is saying, there are studies, there are prefabricated studies. Some of them, as he indicated, are pretty lame.
Yeah.
Well, because they're really designed for people at various levels of faith, maturity, and so on.
Yeah.
I think this bunch that meets regularly as a very mature, and I don't mean in terms of age, although that may be true, but in terms of faith development, we are, I think, a group of very mature individuals. So that's a different style and a different way of doing things. So and every leader is different. Like, I kind of shoot from the hip sometimes, and I'm also the rector, so I have this big vision of the church and the parish and all of that. So we bring a lot of that in as examples. But there still can be very fruitful conversation, as you know from your classwork at Stevenson.
Yeah.
When the material is fresh and new, when people don't really know what it's about.
Yes. And the second is when Bill Nagel gets back from Atlanta, I'm going to have him take a look at the St. Patrick's window in the cloister.
Oh, okay.
It looks like it's getting rotten.
Well, that's that area where it had been leaking and leaking and leaking.
Yeah,
and
but I said the two windows at both corners.
Yeah. Now, because of the new roof, they finally dried out, I think, and now we're getting dry rot in those areas. So we knew that was going to have to be taken care of.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if anything's in imminent danger of falling out.
Probably not, because it's the outside seal that you have to worry about.
Yeah, but I just want to be on the safe side when he's in there looking.
Yeah.
Because I looked at that and I just went, ugh.
Yeah, but that's a very specialized work because that wood has to be bent and all that.
I know
he can do it, but it takes a long time to do.
Oh, yeah, it does. I know I have somebody who's bent cherry here.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience.
Yeah. All right, great. All right, so we'll see you folks. Ken and I are taking off. We'll be out of country from Saturday to Thursday. And pray for us for a safe voyage. Weather looks good, both sailing and on the island. So I think I'll come back. Hopefully I'll be well rested. It's only 5 days, so I may not have enough time away, but
Well, enjoy.
okay. So
And
we'll see.
don't try to pack too many things into 5 days.
Oh, no. We're not doing that. Okay. All right. So we'll see you in 2 weeks then.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.